After welcoming the Romans with a warm and cordial greeting, St. Paul switches on a cold shower to awaken his readers. The wrath of God is really being revealed from heaven against every impiety and wickedness of those who hide the truth by their wickedness. Then, in what can only be regarded as a prophetic map, St. Paul portrays a process of rebellion that would eventually result in the judgment of the nations. In reality, what he depicts is strikingly similar to the time span from 400 years ago to the present. It's as though St. Paul was writing for this very moment, unknowingly. He goes on to say of people who suppress the truth, because what may be understood about God is obvious to them, because God made it evident to them. Ever since the creation of the world, His invisible attributes of eternal power and divinity have been able to be understood and perceived in what He has made. Science was emerging with new powers and discoveries at the start of the so-called Enlightenment period 4 centuries ago. But, rather than honoring God for the wonders of creation, men, following in the footsteps of Adam and Eve, felt that they, too, might become like God. Those who followed the intellectual current of modernity that inspired, were mistaken in believing that science would redeem man. Such an expectation is too much to ask of science, such hope is deceitful. Science can make a significant contribution to making the planet and humanity more human. However, it has the potential to destroy humanity and the entire globe unless it is guided by forces that exist outside of it. Indeed, the great dragon, that ancient serpent, who is called the devil and Satan, began one of his final assaults on humanity not in the form of violence, which would develop later, but philosophy. Through sophistries, the dragon begins to lie, not with an outright denial of God, but a suppression of the truth. And thus, writes Paul, although they knew God, they did not accord Him glory as God or give Him thanks. Instead, they became vain in their reasoning, and their senseless minds were darkened. What a deception! False enlightenment looks as light, and error is to be misinterpreted as truth. Indeed, we can see how vanity has poisoned men and darkened their reason in hindsight. One errant philosophy after another, like a slow-motion eclipse, has gradually obscured more and more truth about God and man himself. Rationalism, scientism, Darwinism, materialism, atheism, Marxism, communism, relativism, and now, individualism, have gradually blocked out the light of divine truth. Like a ship that veers slightly off course, it ends up completely lost hundreds of kilometers over the ocean. They seemed to be smart, but they became idiots when they swapped the glory of the immortal God for the likeness of a mortal man, birds, four-legged creatures, or snakes. How many things in today's world match this description? Do birds and four-legged creatures not have greater rights than an unborn child? And hasn't our generation exchanged God's glory for the likeness of a mortal man's image? That is, hasn't a sexualized selfie culture, individualism and body worship displaced God worship in many souls? And isn't a large section of the population engrossed in a television, computer, or smartphone screen rather than contemplating God's face? And in terms of God's exchange for the likeness of a mortal man, isn't the technological revolution quickly replacing laborers with machines, developing sex robots, and computer chips to interact with human brains? God handed them over to impurity through the lusts of their hearts for the mutual degradation of their bodies. They exchanged the truth of God for a lie and revered and worshipped the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Indeed, the pinnacle of the Enlightenment period, or known as the sexual revolution, was an anthropological earthquake that separated sex, a sign and symbol of the interior communion of the Holy Trinity, from its procreative function. Marriage was no longer regarded as an essential building block of society, and children were regarded as an impediment to pleasure. This revolution laid the foundations for the last ism, in which man and woman were separated from themselves, from the awareness and reality of their basic natures. God created man in his own image. In the image of God, male and female he created them. Genesis chapter 1 verse 27. In the fight for the family, the very notion of what being human really means is being called into question. The profound facet of this theory, that sex is no longer an element of nature but a social role people choose for themselves, and of the anthropological revolution contained within it, is obvious. In search of the fundamental foundations of the conflict between the cultures of life and cultures of death, we must go to the heart of modern man's tragedy, the eclipse of the sense of God and of man, which ultimately leads to a practical materialism that promotes individualism, utilitarianism, and hedonism. Individualism. That is, in the absence of any reference to God, moral absolutes, or natural law, the only incentive left is to do whatever offers the most pleasure in the present. Now that I am God, all I have at my disposal, even my body, is to fulfill this intoxicating desire for pleasure. And thus, St. Paul reveals the stunning end of this progression that began with a denial of God, and ends with the denial of one's very self. Romans chapter 1 verse 26 and 27. For this reason God gave them up to dishonorable passions. For their women exchanged natural relations for those that are contrary to nature, and the men likewise gave up natural relations with women and were consumed with passion for one another, men committing shameless acts with men and receiving in themselves the due penalty for their error. Rom chapter 1 verse 32. Though they know God's righteous decree that those who practice such things deserve to die, they not only do them but give approval to those who practice them. We observe the celebration and even praise of the vulgar and blasphemous, undermining God's magnificent plan in creating us, in our own bodies, for connection with one another and with Himself. God is mocked on our streets, and it is welcomed with praise and applause in our community, yet we remain mute. St. Paul later describes this development of rebellion against God's intentions in a letter to the Thessalonians. He refers to it as an apostasy from truth that results in the appearance of Antichrist, who opposes and exalts himself against every so-called God or object of worship, so that he takes his seat in the temple of God, proclaiming himself to be God. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 verse 4. Don't you see, brothers and sisters? Antichrist is hailed by the nations precisely because he embodies everything that generation has come to embrace. That I am God, I am the object of worship, I can manipulate all things, I am the end of my existence, I am. It is a relativism that recognizes nothing as definite, and which leaves as the ultimate measure only one's ego and desires. Therefore God sends upon them a strong delusion, to make them believe what is false, so that all may be condemned who did not believe the truth but had pleasure in unrighteousness. However, if the Romans or we rise up in self-righteous indignation and condemnation, St. Paul quickly warns them, therefore, any one of you who passes judgment is without justification. Because the criteria by which you assess somebody is the same standard by which you judge yourself, because you, the judge, do the same things. That is why, my brothers and sisters, God cautions us all to come out of Babylon, to depart from her, my people, so that you do not partake in her sins and receive a share in her plagues, because her sins are piled up to the sky. I'm not sure what God's timetable is. However, St. Paul's path shows that we are perilously near to reaching the pinnacle of human rebellion, that great apostasy from God. Who can deny that society is suffering now, more than ever before, from a dreadful and deep-rooted sickness that, increasing every day and eating into its very soul, is leading it to destruction? You realize what this sickness is, venerable brethren: apostasy from God. When all of this is examined, there is cause to be concerned that this enormous perversion may be a foretaste, and may be the beginning, of the evils prepared for the last days, and that the son of perdition of whom the apostle speaks may already be present in the world. There will be numerous battles, and the right order will be destroyed, during the time when Antichrist is born on earth. Heresy will be rampant, and the heretics will preach their errors openly without restraint. Even among Christians, doubt and skepticism will be entertained concerning the beliefs of Catholicism. The foundations of the earth are threatened, but they are threatened by our behavior. The outer foundations are shaken because the inner foundations are shaken, the moral and religious foundations, the faith that leads to the right way of life. If foundations are destroyed, what can the righteous do?